In the beginning, on the water that was everywhere, a downy feather swirled and swirled upon a tiny fleck of foam. If you were a Yuki Indian child living in what is now Mendocino County in 13,000 BCE, you might have listened enraptured as an elder began to tell this story of creation, one version of many that existed among the earliest of North American cultures. "Listen closely to the feather," the elder might have intoned, "and you will hear the singing of Taikamol, the world's creator, whose name means he who goes alone." Swirling and singing, Taikamol rose up from the water and became a man. But he was not alone. Hanging from his body was another god, the god Coyote, the selfish one of death and pain. With Coyote at his side, Taikamol made a basket from parts of his own body. Reaching deep into the basket, he drew forth a ball of mud, which he moulded with pine pitch to make the earth. Jealous Coyote clung to Taikamol as he travelled over the new earth 4 times from north to south, fastening its 4 corners with a sky made from the skins of 4 whales. This earth is good, Taikamol thought, and so he wanted to share all he had created. Reaching deep again into his basket, he found sticks of wood and placed them in a protected place, a kind of house. Through the night, Taikamol was swirling and singing over this house, with Coyote hovering at his side and peeking sharply into the dwelling with his jealousy growing. When dawn broke the darkness, the sticks walked as people into the morning. Taikamol was filled with joy at his creation and wanted people to live forever, but jealous Coyote wanted them to die. When the first son died and was buried, Taikamol offered to bring him back to life, but Coyote said that the dead should remain dead. The other gods agreed, and for that reason people do not come to life again after they die. As the elder finished, your young eyes might have shone as you repeated softly to yourself, "For that reason people do not come to life again after they die." Creative stories such as this one, passed on through the generations, reflect the very diversity of California itself, distinctive from its beginnings in its geographic formations, climate, variety, and plenitude of flora and fauna, and the multiplicity of its Indian peoples. The earliest human history of this region shows that in California, no single generalization could ever capture reality. It has always been an unusual locale where a large population of diverse peoples could live together and thrive because of its lush environment. Diversity, origins of California and its native peoples. The land that the Yukis believe was created by Taikamol was located at that time at about the same latitude as 21st century Cuba. It later became known as California. For millions of years, a large portion of this land would be slowly pushed north as the tectonic plate west of the present-day Sierra Nevada mountains moved with periodic shudders we call earthquakes. The immense forces of the superheated radioactive solid iron core and the molten layers below the crust are constantly propelling the Earth's surface. As this movement occurs, the relatively thin rock Earth surface cracks and shifts, forming new land masses and the present continents. These large land masses continued to move. Those places where the crust has broken because of this movement are called the tectonic plates or earthquake faults, and they have been a significant part of California's history. 60 million years ago, ocean waves lapped the western side of the Sierra Nevada mountains, which were then merely well-worn hills. These hills allowed the winds to carry torrential tropical rains eastward, where the ocean's moisture created a tropical forest with great varieties of exotic plants and animals. In some places, the annual rainfall exceeded 50 inches. This area is now known as the Great Basin and includes the present-day states of Nevada, Arizona, and Utah. In Cenozoic California, 66 million years ago, the great dinosaurs that had once ranged over the land had already mysteriously disappeared, and warm-blooded mammals such as lions, giant sloths, and camels roamed the land. 43 million years later, the Earth began to move upward, thrust by tremendous volcanic pressures in its crust. Miocene period 23 million years ago. A series of earthquakes thrust up solid rock formations, including the Sierra Nevada range, pushed 10,000 feet up in the air, and the coastal mountain ranges. These mountains were massive enough to cut off the flow of rainstorms that had been watering the Great Basin. To the east of these mountains, a desert began to develop. Mount Lassen and other now extinct volcanoes erupted, darkening the skies and layering the earth with rich ash. Mount Shasta, Mount Whitney, and scores of other enormous peaks reached their present altitudes. Simultaneously, the climate began to cool around the world, perhaps because a chain of volcanoes between North and South America filled in the Panama lowlands and stopped water circulation between the Pacific and Atlantic Oceans. Or perhaps because of the uplift of the great Himalayan mountain ranges, which changed airflow patterns. After the formation of mountain ranges, cooling continued for the next few million years, the late Pleistocene period. Enormous glaciers crept slowly south, carrying with them billions of tons of rock and earth, levelling mountains and filling in valleys. Death Valley, the lowest spot in North America, 282 feet below sea level, was born of the upward and downward movement of the Earth's crust, and between glacier movements was filled with fresh water. The glaciers cut through the mountains, creating the beautiful Yosemite Valley. As the polar caps grew, the ocean froze and retreated, exposing new land, including millions of acres of valleys and hills west of the mountains, which are now the San Joaquin Valley in Southern California. The retreating water also created a new coastline. The San Francisco, Monterey, and San Diego harbors appeared. About 100,000 years ago, a narrow land bridge connecting the Asian continent with North America was exposed. Animals began to find their way across. The horse, then merely a few feet tall, and the camel wandered north and west from North America into China, and then Africa, where their evolution and eventual domestication changed human history. From Asia to North America came new animals, such as the bison and mammoth, followed by human beings. Most American scientists believe that these humans came as part of a larger migration of people who crossed the Bering Strait from Asia, followed the big game animals south, and reached the southern tip of South America within 10,000 years, perhaps in some cases using ocean-going canoes to travel down the Pacific coast. Despite the general agreement among American scientists about the Asian origin of these people, European experts are more skeptical of the certainty of the evidence of a Bering Strait crossing, and native people themselves have different versions of their origins. There is a noticeable absence of accounts of migration from a land of ice and snow in the traditional stories of the American Indian people. The Hopis, for example, tells of travelling to the north from their warm lands until they reached a land of perpetual snow. Some tribes believe that the earth was prepared for them by the gods, and that humans did not migrate to their land, but were suddenly created there. Still others have no primal origin legend, but only stories of migration from the east, not the north. Although radiocarbon tests of human remains located on Santa Rosa Island off the coast of Santa Barbara indicate that these first families arrived 30,000 years ago, these data are also under scrutiny. Several scholars of Native American history have seriously questioned the dating of human settlements, noting unexplained evidence that could mean human beings lived in North America much earlier. Indeed, anthropologists and archaeologists debate the radiocarbon tests that show evidence of humans in the area as far back as 40,000 BCE. The native peoples in California were scattered, and they spoke more than 100 different languages. Nowhere else in North America, outside of central Mexico, did so many Indian groups congregate in such density with so much diversity. After almost 50 years of scientific scholarship and debate, most historians and anthropologists concede that perhaps as many as 300,000 people lived in California before the first European settlement. Anthropologists have generally classified these first inhabitants into 6 groups based on their common root languages, with their linguistic origins, suggesting their movement from different geographic regions. The first and largest were the Penutian-speaking peoples, living in numerous bands and clans, mostly in central and northern California. They were most closely related to the Indian peoples of the Pacific Northwest, and may have arrived by moving down the coast, by boat or on foot. Next were the Hokan-speaking peoples, scattered throughout the state as far north as Shasta County and south as San Diego. They appear to have migrated from the southwest, present-day Arizona and New Mexico. The Uto-Aztecan-speaking people lived along the Kern River in the Mojave and Colorado deserts and the Los Angeles Basin, and they seem to have traveled from the southwest or perhaps mainland Mexico. Smaller groups included Athabascan-speaking people living in extreme northern California who probably entered from Alaska, and the Algic-Stock peoples, including the Yiot and Yurok Indians who lived along the northern coast in Humboldt County. The Algic-Stock languages are related to those of the Algonquians in the eastern part of the United States. A small group of Yukian-speaking peoples lived in northern Mendocino County. Their language is unique to California and has no relation to any other in North America. They were split into 4 groups, geographically separated from each other, and each spoke a different dialect of their language. Their origins are uncertain. At first, these various Indians lived in bands, small groups of 2 or 3 extended families whose membership was voluntary and changing. However, as the population increased, they began to form lineages, or larger permanent groupings of families who were forbidden to intermarry because they claimed a common ancestor. Clans developed next, formed by amalgamating several biologically related lineages. Some coastal native peoples eventually created larger social and political systems, organizing what could be called towns. The Chumash people, for example, who lived in what later became Santa Barbara and Ventura, and on the coastal islands had large governments and complex social systems. All 100 or so California language groups, which anthropologists call triblets or village communities, had distinct territorial and spiritual identities, group histories, and destinies. Politically, the California natives developed 2 kinds of government, with a headman assisted by a governing council. The first kind of government included a lineage group who all traced their descent from a common ancestor, while the second was a band of individuals who were not all blood-related. The lineage-based governments had more institutionalized forms of political decision-making, with a stable council and headman. In the band-based government, decisions were made by the headman and council as needs arose. Like the Chumash, the Gabrielino Tongva people, also in Southern California, seem to have evolved complex political governing systems that could govern large villages with many different clans and lineages. But anthropologists are not certain as to their exact form of government. Everywhere in California, before the Spanish arrived, the Native American government often mixed spiritual with secular authority. All of these systems grew out of this land of tremendous contrasts, lush valleys and grasslands teeming with game and edible plants, formidable mountains whose deep snows made life nearly impossible in the winters, vast deserts with little water and ferocious heat in the summer, and finally, a coastal littoral whose mild climate and multitudes of fish and wildlife invited settlement. Although its first inhabitants found the desert climates cooler and fresh water more plentiful, Californians today share with them the area's impressive environmental diversity unique in the United States. In one day, a person can drive from a foggy seashore beach through lush, irrigated valleys, past snow-covered mountains, and into a blistering, arid desert. In the 21st century, we find that the southwestern part of the state, including the Los Angeles, San Gabriel, and San Fernando valleys, has a relatively arid, semi-Mediterranean climate, with large variations in rainfall from the mountains to the coastal plains. The mild climate has attracted millions of residents. Although the southern mountain ranges surrounding the coastal littoral are high enough, 6,000, 11,000 feet, to have snow in the winter, providing some natural springs and rivers, this is not enough water for the burgeoning population. Water is imported to the south from northern California's rivers and the Colorado River, and the large population has caused water and air pollution, not to mention the decimation of native plants and animals. North of Santa Barbara, along the California coast, the climate changes as the Coast Range, whose hills and mountains are between 1,000 and 5,000 feet high, traps the offshore breezes and prevents the reduction of inland heat. The north-central coastal mountains and valleys have their own unique environment, cooler than Southern California, with more precipitation. Summers are generally overcast and foggy, while winter skies are brilliant, with the rainy season beginning sometime after January. Here, one can find some of California's most beautiful coastal scenery. Morro Bay, an impressive rock sentry guard, is north of Santa Barbara. Further north along the coast is Big Sur with its breathtaking ocean vistas, waterfalls and towering redwoods. Just north of Big Sur, Monterey Bay is one of the richest aquatic wildlife regions in the world. Inland from here are rolling hills with oak trees, grasslands and fertile alluvial valleys, the largest of which is Salinas Valley. Further north is San Francisco Bay, one of the most impressive natural harbours in the world, covering more than 400 square miles. Its entrance, the Golden Gate, is so narrow that the bay is really more like an inland sea, surrounded by low-lying hills rich in vegetation. The extensiveness of the bay and its connection with the Sacramento and San Joaquin rivers make water transportation of prime importance. Today, ocean-going cargo ships can dock at Sacramento or Stockton. The bay gives easy access to the fertile Sonoma and Santa Clara valleys. The climate in this region of California is always cool and much wetter than in Southern California. North from here, the terrain changes. The coast is rugged from the Russian River to the Oregon border, with steep cliffs that hug the ocean. Frequent storms lash the beaches, and there are few harbours, the most notable being Humboldt Bay. This region has redwood and pine forests, interspersed with woodland grass and small valleys. East of this northern coastal region, a tableland, interspersed with mountain ranges and the majestic snow-capped peaks of Mount Lassen and Mount Shasta, provides evidence of a prehistoric volcanic past. Between forests of pine and fir that cover, the mountain ranges are the flatlands, the product of ancient lava flows, with an elevation between 3,000 and 5,000 feet, covered with sagebrush and junipers. Rain and snow define the seasons. Lakes and rivers are plentiful. The most mountainous region of California is the Sierra Nevada, a range running some 400 miles from Mount Lassen in the north to the Tejon Pass in the south. Mount Whitney, 14,594 feet in elevation, one of the tallest mountains in the continental United States, resides here with other peaks nearly as high. The Sierra Mountains include the awe-inspiring Yosemite Valley and Sequoia National Park, along with breathtaking waterfalls, rapidly flowing mountain streams and rivers, and the largest freshwater lake in the state, Lake Tahoe. The Sierras provide much of the water that the entire state depends upon. On average, more than 50 inches of rain are captured in the winter mountain snowfall, providing year-round water for the Kern, Yosemite, San Joaquin, Sacramento, Tuolumne, Stanislaus, and other rivers. The discovery of gold here in 1848 changed California forever. South and east of the Sierras lies a vast desert that harbours a rich diversity of plant and animal life. Sage, cacti, and grasses survive the fierce heat of the desert summer, while juniper and piñon trees grow on the higher plateaus. After a brief rainy season in March or April, the desert explodes in wildflowers, some seeds of which can lie dormant for years. The desert region has the lowest point in the United States, Death Valley, 282 feet below sea level, and several lakes of historical importance, notably Mono and Owens Lakes. Imperial and Coachella valleys in the southern desert are primely important today as agricultural centres, thanks to irrigation. The huge Salton Sea receives the runoff of excess irrigation water from the Imperial Valley. It was created in the early 1900s by a temporary rechanneling of the Colorado River, and today its salinity is greater than that of seawater. The 450-mile-long Central Valley lies between the Sierra Nevada and the coastal mountains and is, on average, 50 miles wide. The San Joaquin River drains the valley in the south and the Sacramento River in the north, fed by numerous tributaries flowing from the Sierras. The two great rivers meet near Sacramento and form a delta region. The temperate weather, soil richness, and increased irrigation availability have made this region invaluable farmland. Although this is a major difference from the times of California's first peoples, they too experienced a land of many contrasts. Contrasts that have led some to say that there are many Californias. Cycles of life, the food quest, spirituality, and rituals. The food quest. Imagine bright sunshine and deep blue skies framing a spry old woman as she leads her granddaughter along the path that winds through the fertile hills of the San Joaquin Valley around 3000 BCE. Spying something in the brush, the elderly woman stops and kneels, as does the girl, looking carefully at the delicate green plant her grandmother is grasping in strong, sure hands. In digging wild potatoes, we never take the mother plant, the grandmother says. We just select the babies that have no flowers, just leaves. We are thinning out the area so that more will grow next year. The girl nods as they set about collecting the flowerless young plants. As their baskets fill, her mind drifts to other harvestings the two have shared, wild onions, tobacco, and bulbs. She breathes deeply of the clear air, remembering the late summer and early autumn when it was acrid with the smell of the annual burnings in the chaparral. Those fires cleared space for the young growth needed for making baskets and increased the places where edible and medicinal plants could be produced. The girl thinks ahead to when she will help her grandmother broadcast the seeds of grain-yielding grasses and green annuals between trees so they can survive the drought. This image, based on a 20th century Yokut description of how the tribe's ancestors passed along knowledge of their natural environment, gives us some idea of how the early peoples managed their environment and dealt with the depletion of larger game that accompanied the population increase of those times. As thousands of years of hunting and gathering gave way to a greater dependence on a variety of grass plants, acorns, and marine life as dietary supplements, the California Indians developed techniques of cultivation, propagation, and preparation to increase their food supply. The burnings this young girl recalls are the early incarnations of a tradition described to anthropologist Florence Schipek by elders of the Kumeyaay peoples of San Diego County in the 1960s. The elders also reported planting and hybridizing oak tree cuttings to produce more acorns. More recently, Monsieur Kat Anderson, in her study of California Indians' management of their natural world, concluded that they practiced a wide variety of techniques, including burning, pruning, sowing, weeding, tilling, that Indians assert were practices to help nature along. Other scholars point to the fish management traditions of the coastal Indians, particularly those living north of Monterey Bay. When the Chinook salmon had semi-annual runs up the Klamath River, it was tradition to allow some of them to pass on to the spawning grounds. The weirs they built to trap them were dismantled at key times to allow the fish to pass, thus conserving the future stock of this important food. All these management techniques were under the spiritual direction of key shamans. While they worked, these two women might have looked across the hills toward the stand of oak trees near their village, grown from cuttings. Oak trees then, as in the 21st century, could be found throughout California, the greater Southwest and northern Mexico. The indigenous peoples of Alta and Baja California developed the techniques that made the highly nutritious fruit of those trees, acorns, into a staple food. Each mature tree of the 7 different species of oak could produce up to 500 pounds of acorns annually, but these nuts could only be gathered for a few weeks each year. To pass the time as they pick greens, the elder reviews with her grandchild how acorns must be leached of their bitter tannic acids to make them edible. She rejects the method of immersing the acorns in mud near a stream bed for several months, for there are all sorts of risks involved in leaving anything on its own like that. She prefers to shell the acorns and grind them into a meal, pouring water over it until the acid leaches out through coiled baskets. Stone or sand basins were also used for the leaching process, which was probably an original innovation of the California Indians. The young girl thought of how her mother, taught by her grandmother, organized the long hours of work required by their small family for several weeks to produce the acorn meal. Later, the meal could be boiled into mush or baked into cakes. In a good season, they could gather enough acorns to make a meal that would last them until the next gathering. She feels grateful for those bountiful years. As the sun sinks lower and the sky turns to pinks and purples, the two women might spot the girl's father and brother near the oak trees, returning from a trade journey to the coast. The pair would be laden with fish and game received in exchange for acorns, trading as the Wyotte peoples did near present-day Eureka. Trade patterns revolved around the need for food. Obsidian was one of the most important and pervasive trade items, a black volcanic glass stone used to make arrow and spear points. Crystal salt, gathered from the Owens Valley and the Colorado River or distilled from seawater, was also commonly traded. The Yuman, Quechan, Indians. Abalone shells from the Pacific Ocean have been found in middens, refuse heaps, on the eastern side of Baja California, indicating a trade in shells between the western coastal communities and those further inland. The stories the two men would surely bring back from their trip might well include tales highlighting the religious significance that the mountains, lakes, rivers, and other natural features had for them. They believed that the land was given to them by the gods and their ancestors, with boundaries established through tradition and warfare. They not only travelled for survival, they also made spiritual journeys. Their concept of the land differed from that of the Europeans in its relation to the spiritual, and their belief that land was for the use of families and clans as groups, not as individuals. Almost every native group had occasion to travel within its territory and occasionally outside it to obtain needed foods or implements, just as this imaginary family did. Given the diversity of California Indian language groups, lineages, bands, clans, and towns, generalizations about them as a whole are difficult to make. We can say that unlike the people living along the Colorado River and further east, they did not develop maize agriculture. Those more eastern tribes cultivated maize, corn, beans, and squash once these plants had spread north from central Mexico after 900 BCE. For the California Indians, however, lush flora and fauna were available to those living near the coast and in the north, so there was no need to develop farming. And in any case, especially in the south, scant rainfall made agriculture without irrigation problematic. Almost all the Western groups had territories that crossed 2 or more ecological food zones, enabling them to draw from different regions in different seasons, and thus not remain wholly dependent on any one food source. California's various Indians were also similar in that they were perhaps the most omnivorous peoples in the Americas, eating practically everything that was not poisonous. Besides acorns, fish and game, they ate insects, shellfish, grasses, lizards, snakes, cactus, and scores of species of wild plants. Baskets, pottery vessels, bows and arrows, harpoons, nets, grinding and cutting stones and other practical implements that line the shelves of California's museums today are evidence of the importance of food gathering to all of the state's various historical cultures. The California Indians actively shaped their natural environment to extract its maximum food value. And they passed on their burgeoning environmental management techniques through oral transmission, usually through shamans or spiritual leaders from generation to generation. The most common management technique was using fire to control brush and tree growth, create a layer of ash that nourished the seed-bearing grasses of the next season, and drive the game into traps. The annual brush clearing by fire was an important ecological activity, creating places where grasses could grow and game could forage. Burning the chaparral regions and grasslands promoted the growth of burn species of edible plants and grasses that normally would not flourish in these areas. Frequent burnings in forested areas also prevented the buildup of dense brush, whose accidental burning might have large-scale disastrous results. Environmental historians believe that land management practices, especially burning, were so significant in maintaining a balance among the land, the flora, and the fauna of pre-conquest California that the decline of the Indian population after European settlement produced a change in the natural environment, a change caused by the unchecked growth of brush and chaparral. As estimated by ethno-historians, perhaps 10% of the plants and 30% of the animals common in pre-Columbian California have since disappeared, victims of encroaching European plants and animals. Perhaps as much as 90% of all flora and fauna present in California today are not native to the region, but have appeared since the arrival of Europeans in North America. Many native life forms have almost disappeared in 21st century California. Before the Spanish, the coastal region hosted thousands of acres of American dune grass and Pacific beach grass. In the American era, European beach grasses gradually replaced these two grasses. These grasses trap more sand and create huge sand dunes, making it harder for other varieties of plants to thrive. Similarly, the coastal prairie regions once contained perennial bunch grasses that varieties of European spreading grasses, including Italian ryegrass and wild oats and barley, have replaced. Spirituality. Although physical nourishment was a time-consuming enterprise for Indian families like the imaginary Yokuts described earlier, the food quest was balanced in their lives with time spent striving to live in harmony with the hidden forces of nature. Spirits inhabited the world of all native peoples in the Americas. Communicating with those spirits occupied a good portion of their lives, especially during seasonal changes and on special occasions such as coming of age, marriage, and death. Imagine another dawn breaking in the life of another Indian family among the Cahuilla. The father has spent some weeks instructing his adolescent son on how to dance, eat, bathe, and participate in one of their community's most important spiritual exercises, the Toloch ceremony. In some Indian groups, girls also participated in this ritual. Gently the father shakes his boy to wakefulness. "Come, my son, the elders are ready," he says, and the boy shakes off his slumber to hurry outside. There, the boy lines up with his friends, all aged 10 to 15, as the shaman inspects them carefully. "You," he points to one, then another, continuing down the line. "You, and you, and you. Come." The boys are escorted to a ceremonial enclosure, where they will remain for a week while the old people dance all night and prepare the Jimson weed potion called Toloch. Mixing the crushed roots of the poisonous datura, or Jimson weed, with water created a narcotic potion that produced visions in those who drank it. The Indians believed these visions were a means of communicating with the supernatural. Where the Toloch cult originated and how it spread is not certain, though some scholars believe it began among the peoples of Southern California and diffused north and east, driven by the dislocations caused by the Spanish occupation. Death can be caused by ingesting Toloch. It was only used with great preparation and supervision by the Indians and drunk perhaps once in a son's life. The shaman supervised the process, and the religious leader of the tribe, who was also an expert in folk medicine. The shaman, usually male but sometimes female, was key to preserving such rituals as the Toloch ceremony. Shamans had power from an animal that came to them in dreams or visions, bestowed upon them by the Great Spirit, so they could help people connect with each other and the natural world. It was believed the shaman could change shapes and become the guardian spirit animal. A hush falls upon the watching crowd when the boys are called forth from their hut into a moonless night a week later. The father looks proudly at his son, who stands tall and unblinking. He can tell the boy is ready to drink and become a man. "Tonight, and only tonight, you taste the Toloch that will transport you to the world of the Great Spirit," the shaman intones, holding high a gourd filled with the sacred potion. Each boy drinks, and the drumming and dancing begin. One by one the boys collapse. As they do, they are carried back into the hut with great jubilation. The father keeps a strong face to squelch any small anxiety he might have as he gently lays down his son, who is muttering now in the throes of his vision. "Go away, Coyote, go away!" the boy cries out suddenly. "I know your tricks and selfish ways." Later, he told his father, "Coyote tempted me to jump from the highest cliff into the swirling waters below, saying he would catch me. 'Drink more Toloche,' he told me. for it will make you powerful like the shaman. Look, like me. I am drinking all the time. Come, we will fly." But I told him no. I know your deceit, for my father told me you are self-destructive and a liar. And Coyote howled as he flew away, hanging his head in shame for his weakness. "You are right, wise boy, do not jump. I cannot catch you, I cannot," he wailed. Then he faded, and I woke up sweating. The boy's father nods wisely as his son finishes describing his vision, for everyone knows Coyote is all of these things, both destructive and regretful. The next night and the next, the boys are called out of the hut and taught songs, law, and correct living. They learn the oral myths passed down through generations, stories about many animals like coyotes, with human personalities and magical powers. These stories also explained the meaning of life and recorded the tribe's own history. Depending on local interpretations, the coyote was a nearly universal mythic figure who could be the trickster or hero. Among the Maidu, for example, the coyote and earthmaker gods were opposed to each other and struggled in the creation of the earth and people. Coyotes appeared in many guises, as messengers, transformers, and creators, but most often as the divine deceiver of humankind. Often myths were related to geographical features of tribal territory, such as a mountain peak, lake, or river. Certainly the boys had heard these tales before, as the telling of them was woven into daily life. How the Great Spirit created the world, why death existed, why human society was organized as it was. But now the boys, too, became responsible for keeping this knowledge alive. An introduction to medicinal law might also have been included in their training, again supervised by the shaman, who also preserved the tribe's vast knowledge of medicine, spiritual incantations, and the uses of various herbs. Like the curanderos, herbal faith healers, among the Mexicans, shamans were holistic medicine practitioners. Using breath and touch in addition to plants and animals, shamans facilitated true cures in the only way thought possible, by bringing the body and the soul into harmony with the natural world. A Chumash Indian, Fernando Librado, told of many cures he witnessed after the afflicted one had been given a tolosh potion to drink. Once a man who had been severely beaten and was near death was revived and completely cured within a few days of drinking tolosh and being rubbed over with tobacco. Another who was in great pain from broken bones received almost immediate relief and was eventually healed after drinking tolosh. While these specialized cures were needed in serious cases, knowledge of medicinal plants was part of the people's cultural heritage. The boys might learn about the many uses of tobacco, grown or traded by almost all the native groups and thought to have curative and spiritual powers when chewed, eaten or smoked. They might be shown medicinal plants good for treating many common ailments, from sore muscles, headaches, cramps and nausea to common colds, rheumatism, cuts, bites, wounds and sores. In their coming-of-age rituals, their sisters might learn about other plants useful for contraception, menstrual problems, and childbirth. When the Spanish began to occupy California, they liberally borrowed from native medicinal law, using special herbs to treat arrow wounds and wild chamomile and manzanilla for respiratory illnesses. Many of our modern medicines derive from the plants used by the North American Indians. Once taught the tribe's ways, the boys eat no meat and drink nothing but cold water for the rest of that month. After this, they are men. Sitting by the fire, the young man who saw Coyote in his visions contemplates his future. His father smiles softly, careful that his son does not see his pride as he observes the seriousness on that youthful face. Then he breaks the young man's reverie. "Tomorrow you will join us on the hunt. Today we prepare ourselves in the Temescal. Come, help carry the rocks." Father and son joined the other village men in placing heated rocks inside the rounded structure made of saplings and covered with grass and hides. This temescal, or sweat house, was another significant part of their spiritual life. Sprinkling water on the rocks, the men gathered inside the steamy hut to chant, sing, smoke, and pray. An hour or two later, they would emerge and immediately plunge into cold water, purified for success in undertakings such as hunting and war. Rituals. When the sun rises and the stars and the moon go down, the old man of the house wakes everyone and begins breakfast, which is meat and tortillas, acorn cakes, for we do not have bread. He takes his bow and arrows and leaves the house with vigorous and quick steps. His old woman stays at home making the meal. The son, if he is a man, works with the men. These words of Pablo Tac, a San Luis Rey mission Indian in the 1820s, offer a glimpse of their daily life before the Spanish arrived. Although generalizations about the diverse Indian communities are difficult to make, each had its own regional version of rituals surrounding marriage, morals and leisure, the activities that gave meaning and purpose to life, all drawn from the sustenance of each of their rich and varied environments. Common to many of these activities was song of one form or another. As the initiation rites of the Cahuilla described earlier, young girls of the Diegueño or Kumeyaay Indians participated in a wakunish, or womanhood ceremony at puberty. A bed of hot sand was prepared, and the girl placed on top of it, surrounded by dancing and singing members of her village. Following this, she returned to her special hut to be instructed in the sacred affairs of the community. A sand painting was used to show the girl her place in the universe, and marriageable girls were tattooed on their chins after a period of fasting. Song and dance are also figured into marriage rituals. Chumash marriage celebrations began with a private ceremony for the family, where invited guests brought presents, according to former mission Indian Fernando Librado. Later there was a feast, followed by what he called a jealousy dance, in which 5 figures performed a burlesque of a love affair and temptations of other men. Pablo Tac remembered another ritual dance of the Luiseño people. The dancers in this dance can be as many as 30, more or less. Going out of the house, they turn their faces to the singers and begin to give kicks, but not hard ones because it is not the time. When the song is finished, the captain of the dancers, touching his feet, cries, "Hoo!" and all fall silent. In some groups, boys were married before they were 21, to a suitable bride selected by their parents from outside the immediate family and the band. The parents gave gifts to the girl's family, and sometimes the boy went to work for his future in-laws to prove he could provide for the girl. There was no formal ceremony among some tribelets, merely an agreement among the parents. During the first weeks after the marriage, village members visited the new couple to confirm they were part of the group. Indian and Spanish morality differed, which was a source of great conflict between them. Though marriage and kinship were usually governed among Indians by strict rules, and patriarchal values held sway, most California Indians did not regard virginity as being of great value. Consequently, premarital sex was rarely forbidden, according to the research of historian Albert Hurtado. Adultery and sexual misconduct by women were sometimes punished by payment of indemnities to wronged husbands and by the whipping of errant wives. However, sexual mores among Indian groups varied as greatly as they did between Indians and Europeans, and sweeping generalizations are perilous. In some groups, women as well as men could divorce their spouses if mistreated. Prostitution was almost unknown among Indians, Hurtado thinks, because marital, premarital and extramarital associations provided sufficient sexual opportunities. Along with many other natives in the Americas, the California Indians also valued a berdache tradition in which homosexual transvestites were thought to have special mystical powers. Many villages regarded them as a third sex, highly valued as marriage partners because of their strength and spiritual gifts. This acceptance of homosexuality, as well as the native people's casual attitudes towards sex, was regarded by Christian missionaries as proof of the Indians' inherent sinfulness. Many California Indians believed in cremating their dead, another practice that was unacceptable to European Catholics of the time. Only when everything is burned can his spirit go into the next world and not have to keep coming back after his things, remembers Delfina Cuero, a Kumeyaay Indian woman born in 1900, in her autobiography. The funeral ceremony of her people, the Kumeyaay, involved cremating the departed along with all their worldly possessions the day after they died. Their bones and ashes were preserved in jars. Gifts were sent from other bands to the deceased's family, along with shell money. Tradition dictated that the shell money be returned to the band, which sent it with more gifts. A year later, the other bands were invited to participate in a mourning ceremony, during which everyone sang songs about the eagle and deer all night long, followed by a great feast in the morning. Figurines made of cattails representing the dead were burned, and food and baskets were given away. Later, the visitors returned the original gifts along with more food. Such exchanges served to promote communication and goodwill among the villages. Singing was also featured in leisure time activities. Songs that kept local legends, myths and history alive were memorized and sung, often directed toward the Great Spirit. Each band had one singer who knew all the songs and stories and taught them to the others. One Luiseno story, The Legend of Taquish, was told through 1050 songs that were sung from sunset on Friday until sunrise on Sunday. There were probably hundreds of such stories among the California people, each encapsulating the soul of the people, transmitting their identity and heritage to the next generation. A popular gambling and guessing song also accompanied a game called Peon. The Indians also participated with great gusto in many other games, emphasizing competition and community. Men and boys engaged in mock battles with one another, using stones instead of arrows, and children played a game of throwing a stick through a rolling hoop. Pablo Tac remembers a ball game resembling modern football that was played with 30 or 40 men and women on each side. The idea was to unearth a hidden ball using sticks and then carry it to the goal while the other team sought to prevent a score. Each game lasted 3 or 4 hours. A closer look, 6 regional peoples. Before the arrival of the Europeans, the varied lives of native Californians reflected the diversity of the land they inhabited. A closer examination of 6 of the many native groups that spread across this land provides greater insight into their similarities and differences. While there were probably more than 500 distinctive tribalists, it is useful to focus on those that were the largest and represented the regional adaptations of these people. From the Gabrielino, Tongva peoples of the south to the Shastans of the north, each group's development was inseparably woven into the fabric of their environment. The Gabrielino, Tongva. The Gabrielino, Tongva peoples migrated to southern California from the greater southwest sometime after 500 BCE. They lived in more than 100 villages scattered throughout the area of present-day Los Angeles and Orange counties and the offshore islands. See map 1.2. Named for the San Gabriel mission constructed near their villages, or rancherias as the Spanish called them, they were a Cupan-speaking people. Part of the Uto-Aztecan family of languages, Cupan is linguistically related to the languages of the Pueblo Indians in New Mexico and the Aztecs of central Mexico. The Gabrielinos worshipped the god Qua-o-a, also called Chinguichnish. According to what is known through Spanish sources, they believed the earth was created by a divine brother and sister who formed the first human, Wiyot, a self-generating male. He had children without a woman. His children poisoned Wiyot, but before he died, he vowed to return. As his children were cremating Wiyot, Coyote appeared and said that he wanted to die with his captain. Coyote jumped into the fire while tearing a piece of meat from Wiyot's stomach and eating it. Soon after that, Chingiching-ish was born, and he then created a new race of people, giving them a body of laws and prescriptions. The reported practice of Gabrielino shamans eating a piece of the flesh of a dead body just before its cremation was supposedly a recreation of the birth of their all-powerful god. Eventually, Chingi-Chingish was taken up into the heavens, dancing a sacred dance, and he became the star. The worship of Chingi-Chingish evolved into a more formalistic religion with special worship places, elaborate ceremonies, and sacrifices to this god, as well as to the sun and moon, who also had divine status. The Gabrielinos also venerated animals, especially the eagle, whom they considered to be the soul of a great leader. Their religion was male-centered. Only men were allowed primary access to divine powers. The veneration of Chingi-Chingish may have been influenced by Catholicism in a syncretic way, mixing European and native beliefs, but it is unclear to what degree. The lengthiest Gabrielino rituals involved deceased tribal members. After a 3-day mourning ceremony with dancing and wailing, the dead were cremated along with all their possessions. Each year, the family conducted another mourning ceremony to honour the deceased one, at which the community's legends were honoured. During the 8-day celebration, the longest and most elaborate of the year, newly born children were given their fathers' names, any remaining possessions of the deceased were burned, and an eagle was ceremonially sacrificed. Like many California native groups, the Gabrielinos were patrilineal, tracing their descent through the father. Arranged marriages often took place, after which a wife moved into the home of her husband and was then forbidden to visit her family of origin, although they could visit her. Divorce was possible, in which case the families returned the wedding gifts. A wife's infidelity was punishable by death or beating. Of the tribe's 3 social classes, leaders and their families were at the top, followed by a middle class of respected families and then by common villagers. Upper and middle class families controlled land and marked the boundaries of their possessions with symbolic figures carved on trees or posts or painted on rocks. Each village had its own autonomous organisation, dominated by one lineage and ruled by a male leader who passed on his power through his male heir. If no male heir existed, the family council might select a related woman. Occasionally, feuds among the various lineages and villages erupted, with villages sometimes allying together to engage in war. Armed and bloody conflicts arose when other tribes trespassed on rancheria lands when women were taken, or when enemies invoked evil powers. The Gabrielino warriors used heavy wooden clubs, reed armour, bows and arrows. The village took part in battles, with women and children as helpers. Enemy wounded were killed on the field, while captured male warriors were publicly tortured and scalped. Most of the time, however, peace reigned, fostered by intermarriages and trade within Gabrielino groups and with the Cahuilla, Chumash and Luiseño. The Gabrielinos' main trade item was steatite, a kind of rock from the island of Santa Catalina used to make carvings of sacred animals. They imported acorns, obsidian and deerskin from the inland territories and exchanged salt, shellfish and sea otter pelts. They also traded with the Pueblo Indians of what is now Arizona and New Mexico. The Chumash. The Chumash people settled in villages in central California around 1000 CE in the area from San Luis Obispo to Malibu on the coastal Channel Islands, San Miguel, Santa Rosa, Santa Cruz and Anacapa, and as far inland as the central San Joaquin Valley. They became one of California's largest language groups and were among the native peoples cited by the European expedition led by Juan Rodriguez Cabrillo in October 1542. Expert craftsmen, especially in woodworking and basketry, constructed planked wooden canoes up to 30 feet long, enabling them to fish far out to sea and visit the offshore islands. Using harpoons with stone points and ropes made of yucca fibre, they hunted sea otters, seals, swordfish and whales. Their large carved oak bowls were the envy of the Europeans. Their wooden-handled knives and arrows remain marvels of beauty. California Indian basketry in general is noted for its decoration and workmanship. Chumash baskets were so tightly woven that when waterproofed with asphalt or tar, they could be used to carry and store water and cook. The tar came from natural pools which had oozed into a small lake in the western region of the Los Angeles basin. The women were responsible for weaving these useful works of art. They also wove fishnets, floor mats, storage baskets, and strainers. Chumash rock art paintings can be found in caves and on rocks and ledges throughout the Santa Barbara area. Many California native groups drew or inscribed designs and mysterious symbols on rocks, but few of these are as colourful and dramatic as those of the Chumash. The designs are abstract, probably done in conjunction with the Toloch ceremony or female puberty rites. The drawings may have been meant to sanctify a particularly holy spot. Almost all of them are located near water in inaccessible regions, far from the coast. The permanent villages of the Chumash included well-constructed round homes built of poles and interwoven grass, some up to 50 feet in diameter and able to hold up to 70 persons. Within these homes were beds on the wood frames, with divisions in between for privacy, and a fire pit in the centre for cooking. Every village had at least one sweat house, many storehouses, a ceremony building, a cemetery, and a recreation house. As did many Californian natives, the Chumash enjoyed a variety of games. A ball game similar to soccer, which is played with a round wooden ball, was popular with boys and men. Females played a hoop game that involved trying to throw a pole through a rolling hoop. Women also gambled alongside men in various games of chance, especially a dice game using walnut shells filled with tar. Like the Gabrielinos, this tribe was patrilineal and had a definite class system. Those who owned the large canoes and were the heads of large families enjoyed high status. Wealthy family members dressed accordingly, adorned with semi-precious stones and rare bird feathers. The area in which the Chumash lived was blessed with many resources. Still, they had extensive trade relationships with surrounding communities. In exchange for deerskins, acorns, obsidian, and precious stones, they traded abalone shells, whalebone, wooden bowls, and asphalt. They were experts at making fishhooks from shells, valuable trade items. Those who lived on the 4 offshore islands visited the mainland periodically to obtain food and luxuries, sometimes paddling more than 40 miles in the open sea and bringing with them a variety of marine items such as sea lion bristles used as needles, whale bones and pelican feathers. According to early European accounts, the Chumash were a gentle people. In the 1770s, Governor Pedro Fages wrote that they were of good disposition, affable, liberal and friendly toward the Spaniards. Among them, punishment was rare, and compensation was the modality of justice. Referees settled disputes, and intertribal wars were fought with restraining rituals and little bloodshed. Their friendly and accepting manner made them good candidates for missionization by the Spanish priests. Within a century, however, epidemics, starvation and displacement reduced the Chumash to near extinction. The Costanoans. The Costanoan peoples migrated to Monterey Bay and the southern part of the San Francisco Bay Area about 500 CE and lived in more than 50 autonomous, relatively small permanent villages. By the time of their first contact with Europeans, they had a population of more than 10,000, divided into 8 language groups, and more than 30 different ethnic populations, each with different names and different dialects. Their name derives from the Spanish Costa coast, but as was the case with many native California peoples, they did not use this name themselves. One group of Costanoans may have been the first miners in California. They excavated a tunnel near present-day New Almaden to mine cinnabar, a compound based on mercury used to make colourful paints. Because this was the only deposit of this particular mineral in California, it was a valuable asset, and the Costanoans fought with surrounding tribes for the rights to the mine. Indians from as far away as the Pacific Northwest travelled to Costanoan territory to trade for cinnabar. Like the Chumash, the Costanoans developed boats, but theirs were made of tule reeds and used for fishing in the bays, transportation, and trading expeditions. They bartered the products of the bays with the interior Indian groups for piñon nuts, acorns, and decorative stones and shells. Warfare with other groups seems to have been more pronounced among the Costanoan peoples, usually caused by trespassing into their territory. Territorial boundaries of ethnic groups were well delineated and frequently marked. In battle, the Costanoans killed male captives and took women. Afterward, the decapitated heads of their enemies adorned their villages. Costanoans shared the common religious tradition that included a creation story involving the destruction of the earth by flooding, followed by the rebirth of people. They believed Coyote taught people to hunt and fish, and was the grandfather of Duck Hawk, a god who helped humans by killing monsters and looking after their welfare. They believed in an afterlife in which they went to another land across the sea. On the day of death, the corpse was cremated. During the mourning ceremony, members of the immediate family covered themselves with ashes and beat themselves in sorrow, a practice which sometimes resulted in their own deaths. It was forbidden to speak a deceased's name until it had been formally given to another within the tribe. Grizzly bears were also venerated as representing important animal spirits and were frequently captured alive and cared for by some tribes. Special shamans dressed in grizzly bear skins and used poisoned claws to kill enemy captives. The Chumash Indian Fernando Librado recalled the ceremonies surrounding the bear medicine man when he was interviewed by anthropologist John P. Harrington in 1914. To make their bear suits, they would first kill a bear and pull its skin off over the head, cutting the paws and skin carefully. Librado remembered that occasionally other Indians would try to kill the bear medicine man, whom they believed to be an evil spirit. But the bear shamans were believed to be protected by the supernatural powers they possessed. They were protected too by the many layers of skins they wore. Costanoan tribal organization was similar to that of the Gabrielino, Tongva, and the Chumash. The position of chief was hereditary, but a strong sense of individual freedom among community members circumscribed any chief's authority. Their social world revolved around the father's family, and they had large families, perhaps averaging 15 per household. Wealthier men had more than one wife, which made for complex arrangements. Among some Costanoans, 3 designations for children indicated known parentage: man's son, man's daughter, and woman's child, unknown father. Marriage appears to have been rather informal, and divorce was easily accomplished, with the children going with the wife. The Miwoks and Yokuts. Other Indian groups lived far from the ocean and European settlement. 2 of these groups were the Miwoks and Yokuts. The Miwoks inhabited an area running from the north and east of San Francisco Bay to Sacramento and the foothills of the Sierras. The Yokuts lived in the San Joaquin Valley south of Sacramento. Like other groups, these 2 populations settled in scattered independent villages, the members of each village speaking a different dialect, although bound by a probable common ancestry in the ancient past. In 1769, the Miwok population probably exceeded 25,000. They were noted for their construction of large, round, subterranean meeting houses, sometimes 40 to 50 feet in diameter, where it was possible to assemble the whole village for important ceremonies and crucial discussions. The Sierra Miwoks built conical homes of bark and wood, insulated by several layers to withstand the cold winters. The Miwoks divided all creatures into 2 types, the water and land descendants, and their social organization and adoption of animal names followed this dualist system. For example, among the Sierra Miwoks, the grizzly bear represented the land and the coyote the water. Individuals were given a personal name according to their relationship to the land or water moieties, sides. The Miwoks had 3 types of leaders: the chief, who arbitrated disputes and administered punishments; the speaker, who organized everyone for ceremonies and work; and the messengers, who acted as representatives to other groups and as announcers during ritual celebrations. Hunters and gatherers, the Miwoks developed various technologies, including seed beaters, dip nets and seines for fish, specialized traps and snares for small game, and deer runs, fenced areas that trapped prey. The Yokuts shared the same linguistic origin as the Miwoks and numbered some 20,000 people who lived in about 40 independent groups. In the south, the Yokuts lived along the banks of the Kern, Tule, King and San Joaquin rivers, along the shore of Tulare Lake. In this era, the San Joaquin Valley was much marshier than it is now, creating a rich aquatic environment. Therefore, the Yokut way of life revolved around the marshes formed by the many rivers in the valley. The ubiquitous tule plant was used to make everything from baskets to canoes, and it was also used for food. Because their food source was always in one place, these Yokuts built permanent villages using large tule mats for construction, and they perfected freshwater fishing with specialized nets, floating tule mats, spring traps, and decoys. They ate mussels, turtles, geese, ducks, and tule and grass seeds, and supplemented this diet with acorns, which they obtained by trade. The Yokuts who lived along the river edges also had access to acorns as a staple food. Some built their river villages on mounds to protect against floods and had small tule huts for each family, but they also built larger assembly structures and sweat houses. They raised dogs, primarily it seems for their meat, and the puppies were an item of trade as far away as Monterey. They had a dualistic family system like that of the Miwoks, whose territory bounded them on the north. Among the foothill Yokuts, plural marriages and divorce were common, and a woman's rights were strongly protected by her family. The Shastans. Finally, in the Klamath and Scott Rivers valleys of the mountainous regions of northern California and southern Oregon, there lived about 3,000 Shastan peoples, a collection of groups who shared dialects of the same language. Noted for their many feuds and wars within their own group, and with other northern groups such as the Modocs, the Shastans fought in retaliation for past insults, injuries, and control of territory. Nevertheless, they maintained trade relations with surrounding rancherias to obtain baskets, obsidian, beads, and animal skins in exchange for acorn meal, salt, and wolf skins. The Shastan peoples, too, were patrilineal, with rule by a headman or chief. The chief's wife was often an important political spokesperson when resolving conflicts. Settlement of disputes usually required payment in clamshell money, deer skins, or woodpecker scalps to the aggrieved party. The headman also regulated the ownership of hunting and fishing territory, which families could inherit. Harsh winters impelled the Shastans to build sturdy, warm, partially excavated dwellings with solid wood logs and boards for walls and roofs. During the summer months, the families lived in temporary camps. They also built large assembly halls for ceremonial purposes, as sweat houses, and for lodging during the winter. Shastan territory was lush with small game, salmon, trout, eels, and turtles. The women were entrusted with fishing, while the men hunted. Deer meat was a primary food source. They also had a gathering culture, with men and women seeking acorns and pine nuts. Cultivated tobacco was offered up as a sacrifice to ensure good hunting. Coyotes are a major figure in Shastan's belief system and are a source of evil and good. The stories used by the Shastans to pass on their beliefs were preoccupied with the pervasiveness of evil, which had to be combated by manipulation of the spiritual world through the offices of male shamans and female doctors. They also seem to have been preoccupied with status, prestige, and the order of society, which made insults and loss of face, great evils and resentments a major theme of cultural life. Significance: the importance of California natives and other North American native peoples in non-Indian history. Beginning in 1769 with the first Spanish settlement, lasting until 1848, when California was transferred to the United States, the California Indians vastly outnumbered the Euro-American population. If history were written emphasizing the most demographically important groups, then, until the discovery of gold, California's history would be primarily that of its native peoples, with small attention given to the Spanish, Mexican, and Anglo immigrants. However, history reflects political and cultural power and is usually written by the conquerors. Spanish, Mexican, and early Anglo-American settlers in California were almost uniformly critical of the native peoples. The Spanish had mixed views about the Indians, whom they considered childlike, indolent, and given to indulge in brutal appetites, while paradoxically seeing them as innocent and naturally God's children. Some Mexican settlers, or pobladors, viewed the native peoples either as dangerous threats to civilization or as lazy peonies who needed strong guidance. The Anglos called the California Indians Digger Indians, classifying them as the most primitive of all North American Indian peoples for lack of such rudimentary accomplishments of civilization as farming and pottery. Such negative valuation allowed Euro-Americans to justify taking Indian lands and destroying their societies. Herbert Howe Bancroft, a famous and influential 19th-century California historian, believed that the California Indians were culturally inferior to the whites. Many modern misconceptions about the level of culture attained by the California Indians can be traced to 19th-century positivist scholars, notably Lewis Henry Morgan, one of those who conceived of all human cultural evolution as progressing through stages of savagery, barbarism, and finally civilization. These scholars tended to equate civilization with the development of agriculture and technology. They relegated food-gathering societies to barbarism, not considering that human intelligence is also reflected in successful environmental adaptation. Such beliefs persisted into the 1960s and even later, with historians and anthropologists usually characterizing the California native cultures as primitive and underdeveloped, thus reflecting prejudices that are the product of ignorance, as well as ethnocentrism born out of racialist ideologies of the past. These attitudes make it hard to remember that much of the drama of those years of conquest was played out against a backdrop of the extensive, rich and diverse native culture that existed across the North American continent. The many groups in California were descendants of natives who had migrated from the east and north, and as such, they shared cultural patterns with the larger Indian society. Along with other Indian peoples in North America in 1492, the California Indians developed a culture that fit their natural environment. Few natives in what later became the United States relied entirely on agriculture. Those who did were mostly limited to New Mexico and Arizona. Most shared an economy based on hunting, gathering, and the selective cultivation of plants. Techniques developed by California Indians for maintaining the ecological balance between the population and the natural world of vegetation and animal life make them the first environmentalists. Their periodic burning of brush areas stimulated the new growth of food crops, decreased insect pests, managed the game, and opened new countries, which helped maintain an equilibrium that was severely disturbed by the Europeans and Americans. Not until the late 20th century would scientists finally realize the wisdom of native management practices. Until at least the mid-19th century, the most important workforce in California was composed of its native peoples. The foundation of the livestock industry and agriculture depended on native labor, as did the construction of early public and private buildings and the first towns. The Spanish and Mexican eras' physical monuments, missions and ranchos were built with Indian labor. The native peoples contributed elements of their language to hundreds of place names, such as Shasta, Napa, Tuolumne, Yuba, Tehachapai, Tecate, and Ukiah. They shared their knowledge of the use of medicinal plants with the first Spanish and Mexican settlers, and they helped them defend their small settlements against attacks by other Indians. Elements of Indian culture found their way into the mission system set up by the Spanish. The first vaqueros, or cowboys in California, were Indians employed by the missions to manage the cattle, sheep, and goats brought by the Spanish. Native cultures, languages, and identities continue to exist within California, making these first people very much part of the state's history from the earliest to the present day. Summary. During the course of millions of years, California evolved into a region of tremendous geographic and natural diversity. The many climates and natural ecosystems helped create the varied ways of life of its hundreds of thousands of first settlers, migrants whose speech derived from 6 linguistic groups and was expressed in more than 100 dialects. The lush plants and game that flourished in California sustained this large Indian population, who created innovative ways of nurturing their natural resources. Despite the multiplicity of their origins and languages, the Indian peoples shared certain values, perhaps reflecting their common origin in prehistoric times. They all managed their natural environment to produce the maximum amount of food, whether by controlled burns, hunting, or scattering wild seeds. Almost all of them developed techniques for harvesting and grinding acorns into staple food and traded with other groups. A rich oral tradition of myths, legends, and stories, especially about the character coyote and the flood event, was common to all groups, as was the veneration of animal spirits. Complex ceremonies, songs, and rituals connected them to their natural environment. They all had shamans who organized their spiritual life, and many used Jimson weed or other psychotropic plants as part of their religion, as well as the temescal or sweat house. Their complex patterns of lineage, relationship, and status, including class systems in some groups, and their relatively small villages, reflected the patterns of all the native peoples on the continent, except the metropolitan civilizations in central Mexico. Their peaceful and non-warlike image has some element of truth to it despite the bloody intertribal warfare that periodically existed. Outside of central Mexico, native peoples rarely engaged in wars of conquest and territorial aggrandizement. The first Californians were neither more nor less sophisticated or warlike than other peoples in North America before the arrival of the Europeans. A review of some of California's most populous indigenous groups illustrates their rich heritage and many accomplishments. Their ability to learn how to live with the incredible diversity and richness of California's climate and geography and develop cultures that balance human and natural resources is an important ideal that seems to be regaining value in the new millennium. Modern anthropologists evaluate cultures on their own merits, not in terms of a universal model of development that favours European culture, such as the models used by 19th century historians and positivist scholars. Ultimately, the California Indians must be understood on their own terms, not in comparison to other Indians or to European and American notions of civilization. In this regard, we must remind ourselves that the native cultures that existed before their contact with Europeans were neither better nor worse than those who would attempt to control them. Then, perhaps, we can better appreciate the true diversity of California's past and how that diversity may shape the future.